Hello, and welcome to another installment of At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a platform where we will learn from people who come from different walks of life, careers, and experiences, but all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of saying yes to the unexpected turns of their lives. And they are now using the power of their voice or podium to make an impact on the world we live in today. At the Podium is the intersection of art, culture, and big thoughts wrapped up in good old-fashioned conversation. Today, I'm thrilled and humbled to share the podium with Will Frears. Will is an award-winning theater and film director. His New York credits include Misery on Broadway, Still Life at MCC, The Water's Edge at the Second Stage, Rainbow Kiss at the Play Company, and God Hates the Irish at the Rattlestick. He also directed the Pulitzer Prize finalist Omnium Gatherum at the Actors Theater of Louisville. His film credits include All Saints' Day and Coach. His writing has appeared in the Paris Review, New York Magazine, the London Review of Books, and 8 by 8. Will is also the founder and director of the Mercury Store, which is a startup space for theater artists, stage directors, and choreographers, providing bodies, space, and time for these artists to look at and examine their work. The Mercury Store is committed to a new way of thinking about how theater gets made. Artistic excellence, a wide diversity of artists, creative and intellectual risk-taking and rigor, and equitable working conditions are its guiding principles. Will holds a BA from Sarah Lawrence College and an MFA from the Yale School of Drama. Will, welcome to At the Podium. Good afternoon, Mr. Frears.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. And you?
I'm doing good. I just moved to chilly Boston, so
Yeah.
I'm getting used to the Northeast weather again, Will. I don't know how you guys do this year after year after year.
You know, as you famously once said to me, champions adjust. It's cold, it's horrible. And every year that I get older, I think, how old do you have to be before you get to move to Miami for the winter?
We have been trying to make this happen for some time, so I'm glad both of our schedules worked out that we could have this conversation. As you know, we talked earlier to Claudia Zelavansky, who works with you at the Mercury Store, and we had a great conversation with her. And I thought, well, if we're going to talk to Claudia, we have to talk to Will and hear it directly from the man who conceived of this really interesting business model, artistic endeavor. And I wanted to talk to you today because I was really intrigued by what you're doing at the Mercury Store, because in essence, you are disrupting the creative process for the American theater. And I don't think I'm overstating that.
I don't know that so much as throwing a gear into it or anything so large. I think it was more just trying to think about a different way of making work, a different sort of point of entry and a different way of imagining what a piece of theater might be and how we might go about how it might be made. So I don't know so much that it's that large. It was sort of rooted. I mean, the idea began sort of in my own dissatisfactions, both with my work and sort of with the life it was asking me to live. So it was both that I would look and I couldn't see a path forward for the kind of work I wanted to be doing, and I couldn't see a place to do the work if I could imagine it. I felt sort of stuck, and so I didn't know what to do anymore, and I needed to do something. And it was also, you know, traditionally in the American theater, that's the moment when you teach or when you leave New York or when you go into television, and television still sometimes appeals to me, but I was teaching, which I was enjoying, but I sort of didn't want to step fully into academia. And my wife was at the time a journalist at New York Magazine, so asking her to leave New York seemed out of the question. So there was a sense of needing something to do, which was quite a lot of it. And with that, a sense of like, what are my dissatisfactions that are sort of characterological and what are my dissatisfactions that are systemic, so that someone with all the privilege and access that I have could still feel so stuck. What would that feel like if you weren't fortunate enough to have those opportunities? And so I sort of began by asking myself those questions and sort of trying to think about what I would like to do, and how if I were to keep doing everything I would like to make work. And then I sort of went out and listened to a lot more and asked the same people those questions and listened to them. And what was interesting was to discover that in sort of what I used to call director, which now seems like a slightly antiquated term, but for sort of theater artists who work in 3 dimensions might be the easiest way to say it. Those dissatisfactions were systemic, and that a lot of it came down to opportunities, that it's sort of the opportunity to be a director was so based either in sort of dramaturgy and working with a playwright on a script on the page, or in production, in directing, having a set, audiences, previews, finish, that you were either in someone else's process or you were finishing your own. And what would it be like if you just stood in the middle of your own process for a minute and sort of thought like, well, what do I mean? And that's sort of the question that we try to keep sort of prompting the people we're working with to ask themselves, like, what do I mean? What am I interested in? What are my concerns? And sort of trying to give them the resources to not answer those questions, because they're not really answerable, but to sort of have space to ask them properly. And that really did feel like, well, a room and some time and some actors. And so on a very simple level, those 3 things, which have been in the theatre since the beginning, sort of what makes a play, we provide them. And then to allow people to sort of work as they wish.
I find it interesting because your work has been so well received and fruitful. Sometimes. I mean, John Lahr says of your play down in Louisville that it was a wow beginning for a career. And I think about, you come from an establishment. You've had very successful parents artistically and creatively. You've had a very successful career artistically and creatively. So it's interesting to hear that you had feelings about that may be counter to what the outside experience of that was watching it happen.
Oh, I'm sure not that I like to imagine, not that I think people spend a lot of time thinking about me, but I'm fairly sure that, like most people, my insides and my outsides don't match. No, I felt sort of very simply stuck, and it felt on some very simple level, it felt like a problem that I couldn't find a way to get from 4 people to 14 people, that I couldn't see a path just in sort of going from, plays of the living, plays of the house to plays of the village. I couldn't find a path from one to the other, and that the things that I was interested in the world weren't showing up in my work. And when I would see, and that was what it was the things that I was interested in weren't showing up in my work. And that was what prompted that decision, was that I couldn't see a path, like I said, to the work I wanted to be doing. Or couldn't imagine what that work might be as well. Mm. So it really felt like inwardly stuck. It wasn't like I had sort of there were things I wanted to do, but it wasn't like I had some great dream that like one day I would do this or I would do that. It was that I couldn't imagine what I could do for the next 5 or 10 years that would sometimes, like, lightning would strike and I would get it right and it would be creatively fulfilling and it would fulfill the things that I like to do with my work. But that couldn't be a project. That would always be kind of accidental. Sometimes it would always be like, oh, look, I'm working with the right collaborators and we all speak the language and have this, which isn't to say we're all the same, but we disagree in the same language. And that it felt too accidental, too hit or miss. But that was part of it.
But do you think what you were feeling was related to the system or related to something else? Because it seems like...
No, I think a lot of it was just my character.
But you said you found other people who sympathized with what you were experiencing as a director?
I mean, a lot of it was sort of not having an artistic home, and not feeling that there were institutions. That the easiest way to is that you were a sort of pitching machine. You pitched, and in a lot of cases you're at grant applications, and if you were good at those two things, you could have a career, and that people would then want you to do the same things you would want to do. You know, that if you'd done a thing well, they would ask you to do it again. And so you couldn't, you know, at one point a theatre, you know, an artistic director asked me to lunch, and I was like, oh, and I was so excited to go, and, you know, we'd love to talk to you about directing. And I was like, that's great. And then I sort of thought they'd be like, well, we've been watching your work, and we really think it's time for you to do Carousel, Henry V, whatever it was. And instead they were like, so what have you got, you know, what do you have in your pocket? And I just thought, well, I need somebody to put things in my pocket. I don't want to. It's not in my nature to be good at that. I want to be in a conversation in which ideas emerge, interesting, strange things. I want a space where I'm allowed to fail, where like, I don't live or die on whatever the New York Times said last time. And that was it, that it really, in a way, a lot of it was saying that I wanted a home. And I think sort of in some way, to answer your question, maybe slightly too personally, like I had a home at home. I was married, I was having children, and I felt much more rooted in my family, rooted in my sense of self, rooted in a community. And so on a very simple level, the idea that I would leave that to go and work regularly just no longer made any sense to me. You know, to leave. I left my oldest. I went and did a play out of town twice, one in her first 2 years, and it was awful. And I came back and she was like, who are you? And I thought, I don't want that. So it was just that feeling of being rooted at home, which was a feeling that had taken a long time to get to, was something that I wanted also in my work. I wanted to be middle-aged. I wanted routine. I wanted sameness. I wanted the security of knowing that if I got it wrong this week, there would be next week. I wanted to sleep in my bed at night.
So you create the concept of the Mercury Store, which you create a space for an artist, choreographer, director to create work without the encumbrances of an artistic director saying, give it to me right now. But it's more of a place where they can.
It's a place to not finish.
Okay.
It's
go into that.
What?
Go into that. That's interesting.
It's a place to, you know, that so much. I mean, at one point when as it was being planned out as a sort of exercise, I did a schedule for a year, and I gave myself, in some moment of hubris, I thought I'll do a 3-week workshop with King Lear, which isn't a play I'm hugely drawn to. And then I thought, well, what would I do? And then I sat there for a minute and I realized horrifyingly that I would direct it. And I would have no idea at the end why I'd spent 3 weeks on King Lear. I would have a production that would be more or less good depending on whether I'd gotten the sort of intangibles right. But I wouldn't know who I was in King Lear. Why had I done that? Who was I looking at? What was my relationship to it? What were my responses? You know, I met this director the other week, and they told me the story about someone had said to them, you should do Taming of the Shrew. And they said, never. And then they thought, wow, I've never had that strong a response. I should probably do Taming of the Shrew to find out why I want to say never. And that's sort of exactly, it was a perfect encapsulation of what was interesting, to try and locate yourself in your work, to locate your curiosities, and to not worry about showing it to other people, to write a draft in 3 dimensions, and then to find a way to talk about that draft.
But if we are creating work, the theater in and of itself, as we know it, requires other people, doesn't it? Does it need to be seen? Or are you saying that the journey is more inward as opposed to creating a consumable piece of theater for people?
I mean, in the end, it needs to be seen, but I think it's more a question of when is it ready to be seen? And should it be seen? And are all things worth seeing? So one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about writers and playwrights is like, they write a draft, they show it to people, they hear it, they tear it apart, they start again, and they go through these extraordinary processes and exercises and conversations and collaborations and moving it forward and retreats. And should it be 3 act or 1 act? Should there be 7 people or 4 people? And at the end of that, they've made a thing. And then they say, here's a thing. And so often when you're a director, you come in when it's already a thing.
Right.
And so it's not that it shouldn't be shown in the end, it's that you as the director, what would happen if you didn't get there when the thing was made, when you weren't moving the pieces around? But what if you made it? What if you went through the exercise yourself?
So it's an interesting proposal that you're making, that in one sense, the director gets that, as you said, they get to locate themselves within Lear or within Taming of the Shrew. And the pressure of delivering that 3-week rehearsal period, you turn around, boop, boop, previews, opening, party, run, you take that off the table, and it becomes a process of not only discovering the play itself, but the director discovering themselves and their process and their work through the work on the piece of art, play, dance, whatever they're making. And you're creating that space for them to do that.
Yes, and in a way, I hope that it also creates a way to collaborate more freely, because it takes away some of the issues of reassurance. You know, I mean, we all need reassurance, but you can talk about your work, you can show people bits of your work without being like, please say you like it because next week 1,200 people are coming. You know, please don't tell me I put the door in the wrong place. The New York Times is coming on Tuesday. Like, so just to be in those things. And so it's really just a way of stepping back. It really is. It's just drafts. It's sort of nothing more complicated or more simple than a draft in 3 dimensions. So filmmakers have cuts of their movies that they show people. Playwrights have drafts. Writers have drafts. Painters have open studios. And yet somehow for a director, so often you're just on a kind of narrowing point. And by the time you show it to somebody, you can change that many things, but you can't say, oh wait, I could do it all differently. And I found, and this was an experience that for me, that what would happen then is when I had an idea, I wouldn't really do the story. I would demonstrate my thesis. I would prove I would become so concerned that my idea held, that the production was about my idea, not about my idea and the story and where they met each other.
I don't know. Do you think the theater, because you know, I spoke to Lisa Channer. We did this with Lisa Channer a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about, in a different way, we had a very long conversation about the relevancy of theater, which I want to ask you about as well. But she said part of the challenge of theater, and I think you're articulating it in a different way, but a similar impact, is that it requires so many elements in order to make a play. And a painter's process can be fairly singular, as can a writer's process, et cetera. But when you start bringing in the elements that are required to create a play, there becomes the issues of economics, time. Are these actors available? Is that director available? And so is the theater world ready to let go of some of that to allow these drafts to exist, as you call them, drafts?
Those are the days when it doesn't, when we're just sort of a nice space to come to work that doesn't do that, and we're just a kind of recharging station for your brain, so that even if the rest of the model holds to the thing it's always been, artists can come work at the Mercury Store for 2 weeks on things that don't do that, and it can just be a way of sort of re-engaging your curiosity, your imagination, the things you're interested in, still without having to like finish it. So if not, you know, there was a few weeks ago, coincidentally, in all 3 studios, people working on Greek tragedy in different forms, and you think, I can't remember the last time I went and saw a Greek tragedy, or when it was produced, or, you know, it's not like you sort of can't turn around in New York without bumping into an Electra. But it was sort of wonderful to think that people were interested in it and playing with it and trying to understand what a chorus means and doing it in so many different ways. that even if nothing else holds, that's still sort of interesting, and the quiet life of just letting people work in that way is enough. And then obviously other days my ambition scales and I think, oh, we'll change everything, but it's somewhere in between.
I wonder, I would love to hear your thought on this. I mean, do you think that theater can still be relevant given the sort of requirements of a play as we traditionally do a play and how that's done? I mean, do you think, because you're talking about something pretty deep about artists locating themselves, and we talk about actors locating themselves within a role, but we never really talk about the director locating themselves in the role. We may talk about what we talk about the play, and we talk about what their vision is, but we don't talk about, well, Will, what was your journey when you were directing us in The Master and Margarita? It never even occurred to me to ask that question.
No, and it's an interesting one because when I revisit that, I think, oh, I'd really like to do that again. And I wonder if I could do it in 90 minutes and make it really funny, because looking back, what I would say is that what I was constantly aware of was that I was doing my thesis.
Right.
And so I sort of puffed myself up to like, this is my thesis. Don't you all understand how important it is? And that sort of now, as I find the world both scarier and funnier, I think, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to do The Master and Margarita in 90 minutes and make it like a sort of insane, tightly run, like antic machine? And I couldn't have done that when I was 27 because what I was mostly doing, having a great time, was like doing my thesis. I was doing my Lear in a sense. I wanted to be serious. And now that's less true. And in a way, I think when I was directing all the time, one of my strengths, my work was always better the funnier it was. And so looking and sort of had a kind of ironic view of the world and a way of finding the world funny. And I think that's
because you have that ironic view of the world.
Yes. And so I could feel when I wasn't working so well that I got not only less funny, but actively unfunny. I stopped liking the audience laughing because I was so concerned that they understood what I was doing. It's not that like I was some sort of, heroic genius and I was oppressed by the system. I was stuck in myself and couldn't find a path out of it. There are plenty of brilliant directors making dazzling, imaginative, highly personal work all over the place. The trouble for me was that I wasn't. And so that was really where it started from.
Based upon what you're describing, with your reaction to your process as it relates to what is required when one directs a play or creates a piece of work in the world of theater, that the Mercury Store is really partly born out of your growth and need as an artist to express and grow that may not have been there when we were 21, 22, however old we were at Yale together. Is that an accurate?
8 and 9.
8 and 9. And I had a lot more hair then. But is that an accurate description? Yeah,
I mean, I think that I like doing this. I like having a job. I really like going to work with other people. And it feels in the best possible way, like every day there's something to think about, and every day there's a new, not a problem, because it's very important actually to not think of it as like, I mean, there are problems and there are fires that need to be put out, but that every day there's a new opportunity to think about something differently. Well, what would this be like? What if we did this instead? That's an interesting person. How can we support them that isn't inside of the metric we've created? So it's a kind of endless opportunity to sort of re-examine the idea every day and to sort of have the possibility of interrogating, so we did this, does this work? Let's spend a week thinking about how we might do it differently. And to do it, I mean, and in a sense though, it's not entirely dissimilar to doing a play because it's still about real estate. Like the thing about doing a play is you have to be in a room. I mean, you don't have to be in a room, but you have to be in some kind of a space. And we are in the end a space. Like we are a building with 4 studios and a certain amount of co-working space, and there's only so many possibilities that are us, but we can't do more things than the building will hold. So in that sense, it is like a play. And so we reshuffle, but what if we did it this way instead? And that's really, and in a sense, what that's trying to offer is like an idea of ambivalence. Well, what if we do it that way and we don't like it? Well, then it's fine, you know. So there's just this idea that it doesn't have to finish. All of those things. So it's really exciting to go in every day and direct it, to be the director of the Mercury Store. What if we did it like this? And to be in that collaboration with the people who I'm lucky enough to work with, who have much better ideas than me about what else we could be doing and have thought about it in completely different ways. And to be in those conversations. So it's very, very fulfilling. And then also to know that like in 3 weeks, we're not all gonna leave, I hope. You know, sort of, and that's a big part of it too, is also to like bring people back, to welcome people. I mean, it's obviously complicated under the current circumstances, but to have part of the idea was to have a lab, and part of the idea was to have a community center, so that you run into your friends there, you see people see each other's work in their nascent stages. You as a director or advisor or choreographer or whatever can bring people into your space. So that idea was sort of also equal to it. That one of the things a lot of directors talked about was their loneliness. You know, and so like, just to do that is quite nice. Just to run into people is really lovely. And it's a thing that I felt as I got older and as my friends got more successful, worked out of town more, had their own, we weren't running into each other anymore. And so those sort of the joys of the sort of communities you make when you're 20, and the sort of which is a great deal of the part of the pleasure of making theatre, is like, how much like being in a barn in Vermont does it feel like? And that felt further and further away. So trying to find ways to bring that back, but not at 4 a.m.
It's interesting. I think you're onto something quite revolutionary if you think of the true idea of what theater can be, which is the idea of community and collaboration and people. It's almost like you're breaking down the fourth wall in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I found that I was having a crisis when I went to the theater, which was that the fourth wall made me, I forgot who I was. There was a way in which I was like, well, if you're pretending I'm not here, then do I exist? Like, it sort of gave me a crisis. And realism gave me a kind of crisis. And so I became very interested in form, in the form of a play, in the form of a piece of theatre. And so part of the way the building is designed is you know, it's these large, very bright, painted white, light-filled rooms. And the idea was to have a form where you could look at something and you knew that you were in a nice room. It wasn't pretend. There is no, it's impossible to have a fourth wall in there. Very deliberately, and that's a formal thing about, like, you know, a piece of theatre which acknowledges that that's what it is. Says this is a, you know, musicals are great because they say, this is a musical, look, I'm singing to you. Do you see me singing to you? A good actor does it. Do you see me perform these amazing things for you? And the joy of that is so extraordinary. And so being in a room with people allows that joy to be sort of ongoing, I hope, rather than pretending. There's no obfuscation. There's no space to obfuscate in these rooms.
That's very interesting, because I think so much of, especially the last, you know, 100 years in the American theater, at least, there was this real slant toward this idea of realism, and the internal, and the actor was, the audience was the observer, but in many ways they weren't the participant. And so it does leave you, it can leave an audience removed from the process. If that's, I mean, that could happen in that process, because it's so internal. It's so, what's happening to me as the actor, what's happening within the life of this play, which is not real.
Mm-hmm. But a great actor, isn't it, always lets you know you're there too. Always is playing brilliantly to the audience at the same time. And that's part of the pleasure of watching those great actors, is they're fully aware of your presence all the time. And I think that, you know, there's there's an important, important historical reasons why American theatre drifted towards realism, some of which is to do with sort of ideas that were current at the time. And part of it, really importantly, was sort of throwing off the shackles of Shakespeare, which is something I'm all in favor of like, let's not do that English thing. It's awesome because the other great American theatre art form, new one, is the musical, which is extraordinary and is as theatrical as a thing might be. And what they're really brilliantly throwing off is Shakespeare. And then, as with all things that start off anti-canon, they become canon, and you have to go looking again. So that what was revolutionary is now the culture.
Right.
Not that we're revolutionaries.
Right. Where did this come from? From within you? Was this there in 8-year-old Will?
God, no. I think I still wanted to be a train driver then. I still want to be a train driver. It came, the sort of the sad part of the story is that it came, my closest friend, who was a composer called Michael Friedman, who died 4.5 years in 2017, and was my closest friend, and a much more imaginative and dazzling thinker and theatre artist than I could ever wish to be. And he and I talked a lot, and we talked as friends, we talked as collaborators, we talked as people in the field, we talked across all of these things, and we talked about his dissatisfactions and my dissatisfactions and I remember that actually, like, we went to the movies one night and came home and we're having like dinner in my kitchen after the movie, and I genuinely cannot remember which of us said, what if you just made a space to do that? And so it really was born out of those long conversations with him in particular, and with myself. And it was like, and it's also important that this doesn't sound modest. I'd been thinking that I would like to be an artistic director, that I was like, oh, I would like to run a theatre. I like the idea of programming. And then I thought, going back to the sort of community aspect and the family aspect, like, I didn't really want to work nights and weekends. Like, on some very simple level, I wanted to be home for dinner. I wanted to take my kids to school and I wanted to be home for dinner. And then again, it was like, well, maybe maybe more people want to be home for dinner. And if you have a theatre, you're maybe changing the margin, you're shifting it a little bit and being slightly different. But this is a bigger idea and it doesn't exist. So it was born out of unhappiness and frustrations and difficulties and ego, ambition, and the sort of where those two things could meet each other.
What do you think Michael would say about the Mercury Store today?
He'd just tell me all the things I was doing wrong. I hope. I wish he would. I wish he was here to tell me. I like to think he'd be very proud of me. It's much less fun without him. There's a couch outside my office, and it's sort of like where I imagine he would sit and shout at me. And he sort of was in some way. He was so much more than this, and we're only a little bit of him, but like, what the Mercury Store is trying to do, he did. He wandered in and out of everybody's rooms. He talked to them seriously about their work. He shouted at them. He threw things out and started again. He read a lot. He read a lot of things that appeared tangential to his work and then showed up. He found the world funny and tragic in equal measures. All we are really, all I am is a sort of pale imitation of his imagination, and sort of trying to think about, like, I ask myself a lot, like, well, what would Michael do? And it's a good question to sort of keep yourself surprised and restless, trying, well, what if we did it differently? And then he'd probably tell me I was a terrible person for some reason that I can't think of right now, but that would be how it would end. And then we'd go and have lunch.
Yeah, he was quite a very gifted human being.
He was extraordinary, and he was a force, like singly a force for argument and change and provocation and like difficult questions, and the sort of an extraordinary mix of being the most supportive and the most challenging person at the same time. So would ask you the most difficult question with the most love. And that's sort of, I mean, we're nowhere, but that's what we're, you know, that's the aspiration.
As I was working on this podcast, I learned something about you that I never knew, and I've known you for over 20 years, Will. So I was surprised that you described yourself as a proud high school dropout.
Oh my God, I didn't tell you, it's the thing I'm proudest of in the whole
You
world.
have never mentioned that to me. It's never come up in the hours we've spent together.
Oh
so
my
I want
goodness.
to know what is that even about, Will?
I mean, I think it's I was an unhappy teenager, and the form that my unhappiness took was that I sort of didn't do any work. I wasn't a particularly good rebel. I mean, a lot of it I look back now and realize was a kind of unhappiness that there was no institution that could come along and save me, but it was also a kind of way of getting to America, of casting off things about my family at the time that I wanted to cast off, things about England that I wanted to cast off, and sort of find my own way forward. And so in a way, it's a story about coming here, and coming here, you know, running away from home when I was 17. And, you know, I walked out of my last exam and thought, this is stupid, and left in the middle of it and came to America. I mean, I say it now it's a joke that I say it, because obviously I have children, and if they dropped out of high school, I would be devastated. And I would think I'd let them down somehow. And I now see that, you know, the privileges of my education weren't wasted on me, even though I didn't give back what it was trying to give me. I can see what it gave me anyway. And I look back at it from the comfort of, like, you know, 2 degrees and a career and all the privilege I have. And it's sort of, I find it funny and slightly ridiculous to still call myself a proud high school dropout. And yet I am, and yet I remain quite proud of it, you know, because I didn't like my school on a simple level. I didn't, you know, when I was 16, the headmaster of the school sent my mum a letter that said that, you know, they couldn't insist that I leave, but they would suggest it because they didn't think I could really handle the rigors of the last 2 years of school. And my mum, all of it, unbeknownst to me, went and said, no, you know, some nicer version of give them another chance, and got them to agree. And when I got my acceptance letter to Yale, my mum told me about this letter. She'd obviously kept it from me at the time. And I said, will you send me a copy of that letter? And she sent me a copy of the letter. And I Xeroxed my acceptance letter to Yale. And I stapled them together, and I wrote, go fuck yourself on it. And I sent it back to the headmaster.
Will, of course you did.
Mm-hmm.
Of course you did.
Yeah. So, you know, proud high school dropout? Sure.
That's what
for the pleasure of that letter.
It was all worth it.
Mm-hmm. And then actually, to be fair to the school, I also wrote to my form teacher, my class teacher, who'd been like a great champion of mine and looked after me and taken a great interest. And I wrote him a letter telling him that it had happened and that I'd sort of found my feet. And he wrote me back a lovely letter about how happy he was. So there's also that version of the story too, that, you know, it's not all rage and resentment. There was kindness there as well, and people who cared about me and looked after me. And I sort of wasn't capable of finding a path forward at the time. And so saying I'm a high school dropout is also a way of reminding myself that I used to be a person who was a high school dropout, and, you know, I'm not now.
I was having a conversation with Lisa Channer, which we talked about earlier. And in that conversation, she asserted this idea that the internet has democratized access to the public airwaves, which is good in many ways. But now that we all have a public platform, everybody's an expert. Everyone has a microphone. And I wonder what your thought is about the idea of expertise in the current public discourse, because I find it somewhat troubling. And does expertise even matter anymore?
I mean, I wish it mattered more. I mean, you know, I say this, I've never run an institution before, and here I am running one. So in that sense, I'm an argument for amateurism. But I also spent 15, 20 years watching how plays get made and learning how it all works. And in the building, in the architecture, in the way we program, there's knowledge. You can see what we know. So I'm in favor of it in that sense. You know, subversion is crucial. And so the problem with experts is you end up in Iraq with experts. So that doesn't seem to be entirely brilliant either. Critical thinking, I think, is what I'm a fan of. You know, knowing that problems have two sides. And if you think you're right in one direction, it almost certainly ensures you're wrong in the other one. And so experience, to the extent that it teaches you to ask that question, what am I doing wrong? What am I missing? Where's the mistake? What am I blind to? And, you know, the problem is that once you start talking about the problem of the internet, you sound like you're a million years old, you know? So I don't want to be like, oh, the internet, so much. It's not, the internet's amazing. And I don't understand it, and it's extraordinary. So I'm not gonna sort of start going on about my problems about the internet, because they're my problems about being 48, really. They're not, the internet doesn't care at all, and nor should it. But like taking a step back, looking a little more slowly, these things at times seem, as I get older, seem more useful. Is that really what I mean? Do I actually mean that? If I said that, somebody said that to me, would I think they were insane? You know, and I don't think Twitter helps that. You know, I don't think Twitter rewards reflection, but I also think Twitter's amazing.
Who were your biggest influences in your life, your career?
I mean, Michael was a contemporary, but a huge influence. The one that it's been on my mind was like the first time I saw Do the Right Thing, and it was revelatory about like what if a world it exploded the world for me in a way that I didn't know was possible. The first time I heard The Clash, the first time I heard Public Enemy, the first time I was old enough to listen to Beethoven, you know, the first time I read Philip Roth. And so it's much less about like, first time I read Beckett, you know, and so it's much less about sort of people who have had, I don't have a kind of story of I never particularly had a mentor. I had people I talked to and people who sort of said interesting things, which I've gleefully stolen, but I'd never had that kind of a person who for many years, which again says more about me than about anything else. But it's really, I mean, you know, without wishing to sound, you know, I find Amy completely extraordinary. And Amy's been the sort of biggest influence as a way of thinking about the world and change, you know, thinking about finding it subversive, finding it funny. So it's really much more sort of my peers than a kind of, again, it sort of goes back to the high school dropout part in me. Like, it's my peers, the people I work with. You know, there are artists I think are sort of extraordinary, you know, people who follow their interests sort of, I mean, people who follow their interests wherever it takes them are people I think are incredible and sort of have the courage to be interested in things that they wouldn't necessarily think they were interested in or be expected to be interested in. And so anyone who finds the world fascinating and perverse, whatever part of that I can take from and listen to and learn from, I'll take. I'm not so singular in my pursuit of an idea. I like to sort of get it. I like to get it anywhere I can, anywhere that there's inspiration and ideas and people to admire. I'll follow them happily, and also happily when I decide that I don't like them anymore, act as if I never met. You know, I'm quite. So I like to think that it's an ongoing process of inspiration rather than a kind of like any single thing that got me from here to there. But there was a transformative. The first time I saw the only time I saw Nicholas Nickleby when I was 7, and I was like, I didn't know that this was possible. First, like I said, the first time I heard The Clash, the first time I saw Do the Right Thing, the first time I saw the Wildfires, you know, there were these events that were like, I didn't know you. Anytime I felt like I didn't know you were allowed to do that, I consider myself inspired.
Mm. What was your biggest leap of faith?
I think the moment I decided that on a personal level, when I decided I could be happy, when I thought that sort of happiness was available to me, was the, you know, it's sort of having taken a kind of whatever it is I'm against it position, to then sort of choose happiness, to choose, you know, I said, like, you know, if I could do it all again, I'd do it all completely differently, but you'd have to promise me I'd end up here again. And I think the moment when I thought that was available to me, that was sort of the biggest changing moment. And I think on a sort of plot level, you know, there's suddenly this building in Gowanus that I am the director of, and who am I to do that? You know, who am I to say, oh, I know what, I understand the American theater, I understand. Who am I to be a revolution? Or, you know, on the days that we are a revolutionary, who am I to be that person? Who am I to say I know anything? You know, and yet every day I sort of have to find some way of being like, oh, and to listen. And that's also because that sounds hubristic, to be like, to go in and listen to people and learn from them, which is the way of it doesn't become a sort of endless, I mean, as I've talked for an hour about myself, but like, that's a big choice, to go in and every day be like, I've got this idea, and every day the way to make this idea better is to listen to people more.
Will Frears, thank you so much for your hour.
Thank you. This was such a, also like so nice to just have an hour with you. Thank you. And now
we don't get that.
Come visit.
We never get that very often anymore.
No,
and that's old sort of grown men.
What I mean about, like, that's part of the idea, like what we're doing and what you're doing here is sort of the same thing we're trying to do there, which is like, what would it be like to just talk to people and find out the things that they think and the peculiar ways in which they think, and then make something out of that. So you're doing it with your podcast, we're doing it there, but it's the same thing, which is like, other people are really, really interesting.
So fascinating. I've had the biggest lesson over the past year, just sitting and talking to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listening, looking, that's all.
Well, thank you again, Will.
Thank you.
And to those of you who are watching or listening, remember, we all have a voice. Use yours wisely.